Today's Hermetic principle is the principle of polarity. I just want to reiterate that the principles as such, the 7 Hermetic principles, were codified in a book called the Kybalion, which is a synthesis and a type of summary of many of the wisdom teachings within the greater Hermetica, which is a very large body of writings. And the Hermetica is a lot more involved than the Kybalion. So I do love the Kybalion. It's a very, very helpful book, and I would recommend it to anybody. But I don't like anybody to get the wrong idea that the Kybalion is a substitute for studying the greater Hermetica. It's a very, very important body of work. It's very challenging. It's very opaque and sometimes really difficult to get through, but it's worth the effort. So I recommend that you get some of that reading as well as reading the Kybalion. In this world, in three-dimensional reality, everything is a part of a pair of opposites. There is nothing in the physical universe, as we understand it, that is a unity. Everything has opposites. Everything has duality of some sort here. So we have light and dark, night and day, male and female, up and down, in and out, hot and cold, sharp and dull, on and on and on and on and on. That's what we call the illusion of this world, the illusion of this world. Now, some of those polarities we will talk about in a different manner when we discuss on a different day the principle of gender. But a lot of those dualities that are part of the illusion that we experience here in three-dimensional reality are not what they appear to be. And it's by studying the polarities within the manifestations of this world. This world is a world of phenomena. It's a phenomenalistic world. And all phenomena in this world appear and have their manifestation through polarity. So even on your hand, you have 2 sides of your hand, and then you have 2 hands, you have 2 eyes, you have 2 nostrils, etc. You have to remember that a lot of these dualities we don't question. Now, for instance, the idea of love and hate, or love and fear, 2 opposite emotions. We don't really question that there's 2. Or poverty and abundance, poverty and prosperity. We don't question the illusion of the idea of polarity with poverty and prosperity. We just assume that that's true. There's either one or the other. We don't question the polarity of light and dark. We just assume, well, there's night and then there's day. There's light and then there's dark. But if we really followed any polarity, we would realize that on one end of a polarity is a not, and on the other end of the polarity is an is. So the polarity of light and dark is not a polarity of 2 things, but it's the illusion of 2 things by the mere fact that there's light and then there's a shadowing or an absence of light, a not light. There's either heat or not heat. There's either love or not love. There's either joy or not joy. There's prosperity or not prosperity. There's God and not God. There's creation and not creation. But in this world, it doesn't look like that. In this world, it looks like there's 2 opposing forces, or sometimes 2 complementary forces that work together, yin and yang, night and dark. In this world, we need light and dark. We need it. We couldn't exist in this world without light and dark. Why? Because this world is an illusion. So we need to keep the illusion going. Otherwise, this world ceases to exist in the way that we are comfortable here. Imagine if there was no rotation of the earth and there was no daytime and nighttime. We couldn't have anything. We couldn't have anything here. We wouldn't be able to live. It's just not, it wouldn't support life in this illusion. So we have to have these illusions, and these illusions have to look real. Otherwise, we can't have experiences here. But if we don't question the reality of them back of the illusion, then we are pushed around by things in this world. And we don't recognize that this world is happening for us, not happening to us. Because usually it feels like the world is happening to us, doesn't it? We're banging around between 2 polarities constantly. We're always bruised because of going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth between polarity and polarity and polarity. And we don't understand that polarity doesn't exist like we think it does here. That polarity is usually the illusion that's necessary in order for us to have three-dimensional experiences, which are not real, ultimately, which are not what they seem to be, which are not what they appear to be, ultimately. So when we recognize that polarity is an illusion, we can actually use the polarity to find our way out of the illusion. Let's say that again. Once we recognize that we are in an illusion and a polarity is a manifestation of an illusion, we can use the polarity to find our way out of the illusion. And in ancient Hermetic texts, this was called polarization or transformation or the reconciliation of opposites. If, for instance, you are feeling like you have poverty, well, any polarity is a scale. A lot of is versus a lot of is not. Or a lot of is and a huge lack of is. So on that polarity of prosperity, poverty, if you're feeling like you have a lot of poverty, then you can notice I'm way over on the not side of this pendulum swing. And what I want is I want to be over on the is side of this pendulum swing. And once you recognize that there is nothing to fight against in poverty because it's just a notness, it's an absence of something, then in order to find your polarization that you're looking for, you need to place your attention on the is part of the polarity rather than the not part of the polarity. And you need to focus on that. You need to put your attention on that. And form follows thought. Remembering back to the principle of mentalism and how to use the laws of your mind. What we focus on is what tends to expand. And so we need to find ways to anchor our mind and or our magic or whatever our practices are, our Hermetic practices. We need to focus on the polarity that we want to exist in rather than being victimized by our own circumstances, bemoaning the fact that we don't have enough money. So we have to polarize ourselves. We have to get back onto the is part of the polarity and really focus our minds and anchor our minds and allow the great power of our minds to reestablish our reality based on where we are now focused, where we are now anchored. Love and fear. If you're in a big bunch of fear, now there's all kinds of manifestations of fear, aren't there? Wherever that fear is manifesting, you have to say, well, where am I on the polarity of love and fear? Because fear is not a thing. Fear is an absence of a thing, because it's on the not side of the pole. So you're very not love when you're on that side of the polarity. And you have to just establish in your mind, well, where am I on what polarity? And where do I feel that I'm existing as far as the degrees to which I'm not having whatever exists on this pole? So I need to get over on the polarity that is love. And I need to anchor and focus my attention where I want it to be so that I can polarize myself. I can transmute my situation or my mind or my emotions, whatever is the problem. I can transmute it based on the fact that I'm anchored. I'm anchoring my mind. My point of thought is very fixed on where I want it to be. And that's the is part of this polarity. Let's say you were having an experience of pain. It seems like pain is an is. But actually, pain is a not. Pain is the absence of maybe health, or pain is maybe the absence of pleasure. You have to determine where that pain is coming from to determine what that is shadowing. But then you need to be able to focus your mind on where you want to be rather than where you think you are, so that you can magnetize yourself to that part of the polarity where you want to exist. Now, ultimately, all spiritual progress gets us to the point where polarities are seen as the illusion that they are. And we no longer feel like we even need to exist in polarity. But at that point, we also don't need to exist on the wheel of birth and death. We don't need to exist in the world as we understand it anyway. And we can exist in eternity, where we actually already do exist, where we are already living and moving and having our being. It's just that we don't know that because we are so obsessed with this illusory experience, which is what we call, in many traditions, a nightmare or a dream or an illusion. So ultimately, once we recognize that polarity doesn't exist, then we are freed from it altogether, just because of the realization of that. But to find that realization, what we do is we work within the polarities to find our way out of the polarities. Because once you recognize that polarity doesn't exist unless there needs to be a shadowing of a principle, then you can find your way up the pole of that principle to where that shadowing is not happening. And then you recognize that the shadowing is not necessary because that principle is eternal. So there doesn't need to be fear in order for there to be love, only if we have it in the world of polarities. Only if we want an experience of fear can we do that. If we want an experience of fear, if we need to, for whatever reason, establish an experience of fear, then we need to use and work within a polarity. But if we don't need that fear, then that polarity doesn't need to exist because love doesn't need a polarity. Love doesn't have an opposite. Prosperity doesn't have an opposite. Health doesn't have an opposite. Love doesn't have an opposite. Good doesn't have an opposite. Pleasure doesn't have an opposite. Joy doesn't have an opposite. Happiness doesn't have an opposite. I read somewhere once where they were trying to talk about the principle of polarity, and they said, well, this means that you don't want to be too happy because something bad is coming on its way. That is not an understanding of the Hermetic principles. That is not what Hermes taught. If you read those books, that is not what he taught. Hermes taught the exact opposite. Hermes taught that joy and happiness are natural, and it's only when we shadow joy and happiness that polarity exists, and that we start having experiences of fear and pain and sadness and upset. Because that's what this world is about, is opposites and polarities. So you have to have pain here. You have to have upset here. You have to have all of those shadows here. Otherwise, you can't live in a world of shadows. But ultimately, that's happening within the realm of an illusion, a hallucination, and it's through the laws of polarity that you can find your way out. You can find your way out, but you just have to recognize when you're in a problem that you're in a polarity and you're on the side of the polarity which is not, rather than the side of the polarity which is. You are on the side of the polarity which is the shadow, rather than the side of the polarity which is the principle. So every principle can be shadowed for manifestation in this world, but that shadow is not the principle. That shadow is a polarity that is created and manifest in this world so that we can have duality here. When you recognize that, it's very easy to take that newly enlightened mind and focus it on anything in this world and recognize, I see a polarity. I'm recognizing that this is working as a polarity, but I understand that that polarity can't really exist. So what is this polarity here for? What is it trying to shadow? What is it trying to give form to? And there's nothing bad. You don't have to say, okay, well, all form is evil, all form is bad because it's shadowing a principle. Not at all. While you're living here, you got to have polarity. While you're living here, you've got to have opposites. While you're living here, you have to have form and shadow. But once you recognize it for what it is, you have power over it rather than it having power over you, because knowledge is power. And anytime I'm stuck on a part of a polarity that is not comfortable or that is very problematic, I have a way out. I have a way out by recognizing that I'm in the illusory experience of polarization rather than the transformative experience of polarization, which I can make occur simply by placing my mind and focusing my mind very intently on the principle rather than its shadow. And that's how I can switch those poles and live in harmony, even in this world of form, even in this world of shadow. I can absolutely have harmony here. I can absolutely have joy and success here. That's not to say that I'll never fall into those negative poles again. Of course I will. But now I'm armed with knowledge on how I can transform myself each and every time. And you can come up with all kinds of wonderful ways to work with the law of polarity. Anytime you have a problem, you start getting excited and say, ooh, good, I get to use my new skills. What's the polarity here? what's the principle and what's the shadow. And so all I need to do right now, just for this exercise of polarity, is fix my mind pointedly on what the principle is that's being shadowed, and I can focus on that principle rather than its shadow, and polarization occurs because form follows thought, and my mind expands into what I'm focused on, and I'm going to just keep it anchored and very, very closely anchored on what I want. Now, a lot of times it's hard to keep our mind focused on what we want and focused on the principle rather than the shadow. And that's where spellcasting and things like that come in handy, because we can use tools and techniques to keep our mind focused on certain things. Not only that, but we can use the laws of correspondences to use symbols in our work to keep our polarization efforts functioning and successful, and leverage our efforts by leaning into symbols that have great deals of Akashic energy that people throughout the ages have used in order to find their ways. So, for instance, if I was thinking in terms of planetary magic, for instance, and I had an experience that I needed to take care of, let's say I was having trouble in a relationship. Maybe we were fighting and there was disharmony in that relationship. So I would say, well, what's the principle? Well, I would say the principle maybe is cooperation. Let's just say that's what it was. So what's the shadow? Well, the shadow is competition, and cooperation is the principle. So I need to focus my mind on cooperation rather than competition. How do I do that? Well, maybe I could work with the planet Venus. Maybe I could use symbols that have been used through the ages. And I can go maybe and get some roses and some teal greens and maybe some beautiful seashells and all kinds of things for an altar, and make a spell that is going to focus my mind on the principle rather than its shadow. And I can cast that spell so that thought form is being established firmly in my mind that keeps my mind focused on the principle rather than its shadow. And so then I can use my magical skills to actually help augment the work that I'm trying to do with this idea of polar transformation. When we work within the Hermetic principles, sometimes it's very difficult to keep our focus. And that's why things like magical techniques are so helpful. Because if it was so easy to only just change your mind about something, everybody would do it. Eventually, you don't need the tools. Eventually, you don't need all that stuff. You can just use your mind. And some people seem to be very talented naturally at that, where they don't need tools. But for the rest of us, it takes a lot of strength that we're not capable of mustering to keep our minds so engaged and so focused on what it is that we want to switch the poles on, that we can really mine our magical skill set, our magical toolbox, to use things in the physical world to anchor our mind on what we want. Now, of course, then you get into another polarity, reality versus superstition, right? So as soon as we start taking the trinkets and the tools out, and we're trying to really respect the symbols and use them properly, right? Then we start getting easily superstitious, and then we're off in another polarity that we're going to have to get ourselves out of. So we got to be careful when we start working magic on any level, but especially on this law of polarity, that we don't allow ourselves to slip into another polarity that is a problem, and that is superstition. The law of polarity is active in this world always. You can't escape it. There is always going to be polarity here. It's just how this world works. But once you recognize that ultimately that is an illusion, then you can use the law of polarity to find escape from the polarity and get right back into the principle which that law of polarity is trying to shadow. And it works very well. And it works like clockwork, and it works all the time. It's just a matter of allowing ourselves to discipline our minds, to train our minds, and to focus our minds in such a way that we can have that kind of success again and again and again. And as always, with any kind of tool like this, we start small within what we call our sphere of influence and expand outward from success to success to success. using that law of polarity to your advantage is always a very powerful way to work. And I recommend that you give it some really, really careful consideration and thought over the next week. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I so appreciate you. Until next time, blessed be.